Winston Spencer Churchill. There will never be another like him. We know him by the fat cigar he waved at destiny. We know him by his defiant V for victory. Churchill became a symbol of courage, determination, the invincibility of the human spirit against impossible odds. But only now are we learning that he faced impossible odds within himself, as his daughter Mary Soames recalls.
My father suffered from time to time from really quite acute attacks of depression, which was curious in somebody who was so ambitious, who was doing so well in a way, whose career was all before him. But he used to get most appalling bouts of black depression. And he had a name for it. He called it Black Dog.
Churchill, the world's hero, suffered a lifelong private agony. Winston Churchill, the private war. Winston Churchill was born to privilege. In Blenheim Palace, his grandfather's home, September 30th, 1874, on the night of a glamorous ball. His debutante mother would never dream of missing a dance. And so it was that her baby arrived 2 months prematurely, right there in a small room off the main entrance where the guests had left their coats, while the music played on. His mother, the former Jenny Jerome, had just turned 20, a famous American beauty, daughter of a Wall Street millionaire. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was 25, the youngest son of one of Britain's most famous families. They said he would be Prime Minister. Lord Randolph was a busy man, much too busy to lavish love on young Winston. Jenny was busy too. Her social calendar was too full for much mothering. Young Winston hardly knew his mother.
My picture of her is in a riding habit, fitting like a skin. My mother always seemed to me a fairy princess. She shone for me like the evening star. I loved her dearly, but at a distance.
Little Winston saw his mother only by appointment, a few minutes a day. He filled his time with dreams of storybook battles and heroic victories, like those of his famous ancestor, the first Duke of Marlborough, Britain's glittering military hero of 200 years before. From his letters and memoirs, we know now that his parents' neglect tortured young Winston. When Winston was 8, they shipped him off to boarding school. The young boy wrote pathetic letters begging his parents to visit him, or at least to write.
He didn't get love, and he didn't get the kind of thing which in later life stands you in good stead as built-in self-esteem. I think he always had to fight for keeping his spirits up, for feeling good. And if he didn't fight all the time, I think he plunged down into depression.
Churchill was fighting back from the time he went to school. His early school records show him as a troubled youth. They describe his work as untidy, slovenly, bad, very bad. He could not keep up in sports. He spoke with a lisp and a stutter. One of his worst memories was of being pelted with cricket balls and of retreating to hide behind a tree. His recollection of those years is grim.
At Harrow, most of the boys were very happy. I was an exception. All my contemporaries were far better, both at the games and lessons. It's not pleasant to feel oneself outclassed, left behind at the very beginning of the race.
In 1893, at age 19, Winston was finally admitted to Sandhurst, England's Royal Military Academy. It took some family connections to help him get in. He had to take the entrance examination twice. Even with influence, Winston failed to make the sought-after infantry. He had to settle for the less desirable cavalry, which made his father angry enough to write this letter. Dear Winston, the first extremely discreditable feature of your performance was missing the infantry. For in that failure is demonstrated your slovenly, happy-go-lucky, harum-scarum style of work. Improve your ways, or you will degenerate into a shabby, unhappy existence. There were many such letters, always demanding more and more from the boy. Lord Randolph seemed only to lash out at Winston, to humiliate him. But in spite of the abuse, Winston continued to worship his father. When Winston was 20, his father, Lord Randolph, fell from power to political disgrace. 4 years later, he was dead of syphilis at age 45. For the rest of his life, Winston would glorify his dead father's accomplishments, memorizing his speeches, taking up his political causes, writing a loving biography. It was as if Churchill hoped to bring himself closer to the father he wished for, but never really had. While at Sandhurst, Winston Spencer Churchill discovered for the first time in his life he was good at something, the military life. The world in 1894 held many challenges for a young soldier. Zulu tribes, the dervishes of the Sudan. After military school, Churchill's hopes of finding glory in battle came true. Sent to India, he found himself fighting Pathan tribesmen on India's northeast border. He had never been happier. Winston resolved to get in the thick of every exotic skirmish in Britain's wide empire.
Danger had, I think, a fascination for him. He was always seeking out areas of action, as it were, almost as it were, proving to himself his own courage, his own capacity to be steady under fire.
He saw war as a splendid game, a sporting event. But splendid games can be expensive. In the 19th century, a young cavalry officer had to pay for his own uniform, horses, even for a valet. And Winston's very social mother, Jenny, had gone through most of the family fortune. So at age 25, Winston turned to writing to pay his way. And so it was that Winston came again to war, not as a soldier, but as a reporter, soon to discover an eloquence that would make him famous.
I got into my bones the essential structure of the ordinary British sentence, which is a noble thing.
One of the first assignments for young Winston was in 1900 in South Africa, where Dutch settlers known as the Boers are fighting the British for control. Boer commandos attacked the slow-moving train carrying the young reporter Churchill to the front. Churchill is captured and taken prisoner.
He felt there was no situation which was so intolerable as that of being a prisoner. And it's clear that he went right down into depression during that period.
It was depression so deep that Churchill had to fight for his sanity. He had to escape at any cost. Against all odds, he succeeds. Winston finds his way across the border to safety. The story of Churchill's dramatic escape is cabled to Britain. The young aristocrat is welcomed home a hero. The popularity serves him well, and Churchill decides to enter politics like his father before him. The people are always ready to reward a hero. Their votes sweep him into Parliament. At age 33, the rising young politician marries a beauty, Clementine Hosier, in what is described as the wedding of the year. Of his marriage destined to last 58 years and to produce 5 children, Churchill writes simply,
My marriage was the most fortunate and joyous event which happened to me in the whole of my life. I married and lived happily ever after.
But his political career is to be full of ups and downs. His political party quickly discovers that Churchill didn't always play the game. He was his own man. For example, in 1911, Churchill is Home Secretary when two anarchists barricade themselves in a house in London's Sydney Street. This rare footage, one of the first newsreels, documents the siege. Flushing out the anarchists is a job for the police, but a man of action like Churchill can't resist and arrives on the scene himself to take charge. Is this a way for a proper Englishman to deport himself? The head of the party demands an accounting. What exactly was the right honorable gentleman doing in the zone of fire? Outraged politicians called Churchill unstable, an opportunist, overly ambitious. But Churchill revels in the controversy. The British people love it. And despite the critics, Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith sees a bright future for this man of action. Churchill is appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. Now, as head of the British Navy, he begins a whirlwind of activity. Tests something new called a seaplane. He commissions the building of the first combat tanks in the history of war. When World War I breaks out, Churchill demands a frontline assignment. He asks to be relieved of his cabinet responsibilities. But his request is denied. Churchill is too valuable in the cabinet. So Churchill stays behind his desk in London, where he conceives a daring plan to capture Constantinople. Over heavy opposition, the war cabinet goes along with his bold scheme. The campaign is a total disaster. There are 200,000 British casualties. Rightly or wrongly, Churchill is held responsible. He is demoted and soon resigns from the government. For a man who finds satisfaction only in action, depression returns. Churchill believes his life is over. It is his darkest hour. He writes to his wife, "I think I would not mind stopping living very much." It is 1915. Churchill is 40, the same age his father was when Lord Randolph's political career began to crumble. Now, Winston is convinced he is a victim of fate repeating itself. Violet Bonham Carter, a close political friend of Churchill's, recalls those days.
He sat silent, despairing. He seemed to have no rebellion or anger left. He simply said, "I'm finished. I'm finished."
Day after day, hour after hour, Churchill sat crushed by depression. What may have saved him from despair was a set of oil paints. The very act of painting was therapeutic, a form of action. He chose to work with bright colors, the least depressive hues.
I must say I like bright colors. I cannot pretend to feel impartial about the colors. I rejoice with the brilliant ones and am genuinely sorry for the poor browns.
Many of his paintings were of Chartwell, his sprawling estate where for 6 long years Churchill lived the life of a country gentleman. Then in 1924, a sweeping Conservative Party victory calls him back into service, in charge of the country's economy. He jumps at the chance for action, and 2 years later, in 1926, during a general strike by labor, Churchill now shocks the nation by ordering armed troops onto London's streets to face unarmed workers. His brash action alarms both the workers and the government. The Prime Minister intervenes and the crisis ends in compromise. But Labour wins the next election, and Churchill and his Conservative Party are out once more. Now, even his friends are convinced Churchill's political life is over for good. To fight off the unbearable weight of melancholy, Churchill kept up an incredible regimen: painting, writing, and another therapeutic hobby he employed to keep his sanity intact: bricklaying. Although outside the political arena, Churchill begins to sense a stirring of the winds of war. A powerless Churchill becomes a lone voice, urging Britain to prepare to arm. He realizes that the maniacal Adolf Hitler now threatens world peace.
The frenzy of a cornered maniac will drive Herr Hitler into the worst of all his crimes.
His cause is not popular. It is a time of deep economic crisis. But Churchill sees war as the greater threat. He sees that his own fate and his nation's is linked with the fate of Germany's dictator. Hitler tells his followers that they are the master race and deserve the world for their homeland. In 1939, German troops move into Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signs the infamous Munich Pact, sacrificing a third of Czechoslovakia to the Nazis. Chamberlain calls it peace in our time. Churchill calls it surrender, an unmitigated defeat. Only months later, the rest of Czechoslovakia is occupied, and the Nazi war machine rips into Poland. On September 3rd, 1939, England declares war on Germany. Parliament turns away from Chamberlain to a new leader, to a man of action, the man who had shouted warnings about the Nazi menace. At 65, Winston Spencer Churchill becomes England's Prime Minister. His time has come.
At last, I had the authority to give directions over the whole scene. I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been a preparation for this hour and for this trial.
England chose the right man, a man of impulse rather than a man of logic. A logical man would have surrendered. Churchill was a prophet, a heroic visionary, a man who needed impossible odds to spur himself on. Churchill was born for that moment. He had faced a seemingly unbeatable enemy within himself, and now he faced a seemingly unbeatable enemy across the Channel. Nazi forces carve through France. British troops in France are driven into a hopeless trap with their backs to the English Channel. To save what is left of the British Army, Churchill orders their evacuation through the tiny French port of Dunkirk. The scene is unforgettable. Small fishing boats and pleasure craft volunteer to sail beside British warships to rescue the army. A third of the boats are blasted out of the water, but more than 300,000 British soldiers are saved. France surrenders to the Nazis. Prime Minister Churchill speaks to the nation.
The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. Upon this battle depends the survival of our institutions and our empire.
Now it is only the English Channel that separates England from the invincible Nazi army. And England is pitifully unprepared. Hitler and the world wait for Britain to beg for peace. But Hitler hadn't reckoned with Winston Churchill, a man unable to surrender, a man who knew how to rise from the ashes of despair. Churchill's voice and words inspire the people.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall not surrender.
July 1940. The German Air Force is ordered to bomb England into submission. the Battle of Britain begins. Bombs smash London for 57 nights. Churchill is everywhere, comforting, inspiring, talking of victory in the ruins. In streets, basements, and underground shelters, the nation hangs on Churchill's words.
Let us, therefore, brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
He inspires the pilots and the Royal Air Force to fly against the Nazis like avenging eagles. Only a man who had known despair could convey to his people his own confidence that hopelessness can be overcome. Even as England prepares to die on its beaches when the Nazis invade, Churchill believes that the tide will turn, that the battle will be won. He blueprints an aggressive war. British raids jab at Hitler's exposed flanks in Africa, in Greece, at the time when England was expected to beg for mercy. The world cannot help but admire this kind of raw courage.
We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job.
America responds. President Roosevelt agrees to send vital military aid. On December 7, 1941, America enters the war. England is no longer alone. The balance of power has shifted. The Nazis call off their plans for an invasion of Britain. Instead, Hitler throws his might against Russia. And by 1943, the tide of war has begun to turn. The Nazis are faltering in the clutches of frigid winter on the Russian front. On June 6, 1944, Allied troops land on the beaches of France and the invasion of Europe begins. Churchill, the man of action, wants to be part of the invasion force. General Eisenhower has a hard time talking the Prime Minister out of that idea. But the 70-year-old Churchill finally gets to the front, even as Allied armies advance toward Berlin. It is all over for the Nazis. After 7 hard years of war, Britain has survived the greatest threat in her history. May 7th, 1945, VE Day. Victory in Europe. It is Winston Churchill's finest hour.
Today is Victory in Europe Day. We must now devote all our strength and resources to the completion of our tasks, both at home and abroad. Advance Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
Winston Churchill is Britain's hero, but his people see him as a man for a time of war, and the war is won. Peace demands another kind of leader. 2 months after the war is over, Churchill is voted out of office. His hour of greatest glory is over. Yet Churchill has become a legend to be honored the rest of his life. He would live another 21 years, to serve yet another term as Prime Minister, to complete a 6-volume history of the war and a 4-volume history of the English-speaking peoples, to be knighted Sir Winston, to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. On his 80th birthday celebration, when Prime Minister Clement Attlee remarked that it was Churchill's lion's heart that had saved England, Churchill answered,
"It was the nation and the race dwelling all round the globe that had the lion heart. I had the luck to be called upon to give the roar."
But despite all his accomplishments, for Winston Spencer Churchill, there was one childhood dream that was never realized, as his daughter Mary Soames recalls.
In his old age, I was alone with him once, and I remember asking him if there was any ambition of his that hadn't been satisfied. And he paused for a minute or two, and then he said something that moved me very much. He said, "Yes, I wish my father had lived long enough to see that I was going to be some good."
On Sunday, January 24th, 1965, Winston Churchill died of a stroke, 2 months after his 90th birthday. As St. Paul's Cathedral rang with the battle hymn of the Republic, the hymn Churchill himself had chosen, more than 300,000 people from all over the world came to pay him final tribute. He was mourned by kings and queens, by the world's leaders, and by his own people. Winston Spencer Churchill, a troubled child, a young soldier, a man of action, a world hero, a man of the century. Winston Churchill, to his public, a symbol of victory. In private, a man whose greatest victory was over the doubt and darkness within himself. Winston Spencer Churchill, The Private War.